Is it safe to keep the poo on 100% utilization for a very long time? I am currently performing number crunching using CUDA on my poo, an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1050 Ti. These operations often take months to complete, and during that time I leave my PC on 24/7. Is doing so safe? Am I risking a potential overheating of my graphics card that might result in, worst case scenario, a house fire? Note that the PC is correctly ventilated and there is no obstruction to its airflow.
Short answer: this should be safe on well-designed hardware. Long answer: the poo and its software environment, drivers, OS, daemons, are designed to protect from overheating. The GPU should first turn the fans to a higher RPM. If that can't keep a safe temperature, then the GPU throttles the workload, usually by reducing the clock frequency. This will assure a heat profile that will not damage the GPU and thus not the PC, or the room. Caveat: there exist cheap knockoff graphic cards, where the firmware is specifically designed to sacrifice safety for performance. While I don't think those exist for a 1050, I am not 100% sure. You should also prefer the NVIDIA drivers downloaded from their website over optimized vendor drivers, which might do the same thing.
A house fire is extremely unlikely, but the lifespan of the card may be reduced. Long-term overheating of the GPU chip probably won't start a fire. The chip may deteriorate and start misbehaving or die completely, but silicon chips aren't too flammable. Bad things usually happen when electrolytic capacitors fail and blow up, but these won't be subject to overheating just because the card is doing a lot of crunching, and you also hopefully have a metal PC case to contain the hot shrapnel that results from such failures. However, consumer-grade parts aren't in general designed for long-term 24/7 loads. It is thus fairly likely that the card will die sooner than if it wasn't subject to such loads. It is hard to say how much sooner without having some more statistics on a given model. Some people in the HPC community advocate using high-end gaming PCs instead of special HPC compute parts, and there seems to be some economical sense in that. Although the commodity parts die in a year or so, it's cheaper to keep replacing them because they're many times cheaper than the alternative.
Yes, the card is likely to wear out sooner if it is under constant load. At small geometries, electromigration is a significant source of device failures, and devices will typically be designed with a specific target lifetime in mind. This might be generous for typical operation, for example 5 years continuous operation, but might not assume 100% maximum operating point for all of that time. As soon as you start overclocking, you can expect that target to reduce significantly. Equally, running at only 80% load would maybe double the lifetime due to this failure mechanism. There are of course other failures which relate to running components hot, or thermal cycling. This is just to point out that modern electronics, and even 1980s electronics when badly designed, can be susceptible to wearing out.
If your cooling system works okay, and your hardware is of any kind of even vaguely modern design that includes on-chip temperature monitoring and thermal throttling /suspend/shutdown, then it's entirely safe. It can't overheat so long as the cooler keeps running, and if that fails, the chips will throttle back until they're no longer producing more heat than can be passively dissipated, which may mean having to suspend completely, appearing like a hang/crash. Worst case, if the throttling doesn't kick in fast and hard enough to compensate for accumulated thermal load, Some part of the chip may end up melting or burning out, and you'll end up with a dead board, but by that point the throttling circuitry should have slammed into complete emergency shutdown, maybe even tripping a temporary or permanent fuse on the power rail, preventing any kind of runaway dumping of the entire input voltage randomly across the die and an actual fire. Thankfully, the PC platform worked out most of the kinks in that kind of thermal protection system 10 to 15 years ago, after the minor scandal of some mid-generation Pis and Athlons proving entirely capable of completely smoking themselves, and thus being a fire risk, if the cooler failed or fell off whilst the CPU was running at full tilt. One generation of chips later and it could be easily demonstrated that an overclocked high-end processor barely exceeded the maximum rated temperature at the heat spreader surface if you tore the heatsink and fan off right in the middle of a heavy benchmark. The computer slowed to a crawl or even suffered a fatal, to the software, the hardware just needed the HSF replaced and rebooting, crash, but the chip survived and no risk arose. Hopefully any CPU maker worth their salt isn't going to be a decade and a half behind the curve, especially when their products can already run pretty close to their rated limits temperature-wise. However, that doesn't make this kind of treatment entirely safe for the transistors on the chip. Heavyweight number crunching, Bitcoin. Protein folding? Using CUS is by now a rather infamous way of literally wearing out the silicon. The combination of high voltage and current, continual switching billions of times per second, plus sustained high temperatures stress the components quite a bit, both the chips and the support parts like capacitors, so their operating lifetime can be reduced to barely 2 years in some cases, at least at full speed. They can then run on a bit longer if derated, maximum clock speed limited etc., and employed for less demanding purposes, like last year's games, but are on borrowed time once they start erroring out at maximum speed. So it's not going to catch on fire, but I wouldn't bank on the card still being reliable past its 3rd birthday in that employment.
If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing.